Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last week I wrapped up the biography of Joseph E. Johnston, and the Patreon members voted for me to cover Ambrose Burnside in this next biography series. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. It was December 1862, and multiple failed attempts to dislodge the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia surrounding the Virginia town of Fredericksburg resulted in disastrous casualties for the Union Army of the Potomac. Frustrated and saddened by the attacks that resulted from his orders, Union Army Commander Major General Ambrose Burnside resolved to lead the Union troops in one final assault. After pleading by his staff and other generals, Burnside decided not to attack. Nevertheless, the defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg came to define Burnside's Civil War military career, and something history has never let him live down. Burnside's very first biographer described his subject in eloquent terms. Ambrose E. Burnside was a valiant soldier, a sound-hearted citizen, and a useful statesman. Living after he had attained his manhood in heroic age, he was alike earnest in the performance of duty, spotless in reputation, loyally patriotic, and faithful in his friendships. Born and reared among the primeval forests of what was then the Far West, he rose from a humble sphere of life to high commands in the armies of the Union, and subsequently to leading positions in the state of his adoption and the national councils. The purity of his motives, the strength of his judgment, his unconquerable will, his indomitable courage, his unstudied yet forcible eloquence from a heart filled with belief, his gracious presence, and his dignified courtesy were only eclipsed by his genial, affectionate, trusting disposition. He made loving kindness the guide of his life. No wrong was done him that he did not forgive, neither did he shrink from assuming the responsibilities of defeat, rather than throw upon others the blame that justly belonged to them. His form and features will be transmitted to future generations by painters, by photographers, and by sculptors, and his career from the breaking out of the rebellion until his untimely death is chronicled on interesting pages of the nation's history. Burnside's great-grandfather, Robert Burnside, escaped from Scotland following the Battle of Culloden, where Robert fought against the British Crown. He settled in the British colony of South Carolina and married Rebecca Dodson. He lived on the bank of the Saluda River and became a successful planter with the help of his growing number of slaves. When the American Revolution erupted on the North American continent, two of his adult sons joined the American colonies in their attempt to throw off the bonds of England. Robert and his son James ironically sided with the British, the same government that Robert fought against in Europe. Robert died before the Revolution ended, but James helped raise a unit of Tories to fight the other colonists. James's two adult brothers fought under Light Horse Harry Lee and Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. When the Revolution seemed to be going against the British, James and his in-laws moved to Jamaica because their land was confiscated by the new American government for being disloyal to the American cause. The British gave them land grants in Jamaica for being loyal and as compensation for their lost land. They didn't stay in Jamaica long. James would get amnesty for his disloyalty through his revolutionary brothers and returned to South Carolina, but died from complications from an illness received in the Caribbean. James's widow, influenced by Quakers' anti-slavery stance, freed their slaves and moved to what would become Indiana. The family wouldn't stay there long either, though. Most of the family either moved further north or back to South Carolina, except for Edgehill Burnside, who settled in the town of Liberty. Edgehill became a pillar of the community and was elected an associate justice on the circuit court, forever getting the nickname judge, even though he mostly worked as a court clerk. He was a well-respected man of the community, and his judgments were seen as a conciliation meeting rather than a sentence bestowed upon one party or another. Edgehill married Pamelia Brown, also of South Carolina. Their fourth child was born on May 23, 1824, in a log cabin near Liberty, and named Ambrose Everett Burnside. The child wasn't breathing when it was born, but the doctor, Dr. Sylvanus Everett, tickled the child's nose with a chicken feather. Ambrose began to breathe. Pamelia named him Ambrose Everett Burnside because the doctor and his wife, Pamelia's dear friend, lost their firstborn child who was named Ambrose Everett. In an effort to show their sympathy and their friendship, the Burnsides named their son after their friend's deceased child. Years later, when entering West Point Military Academy, Ambrose's middle name would be written down as Everett by mistake, but the error was never corrected. Ambrose Burnside had a frontier childhood, and his father's love of education led to the young man being educated at a local seminary. He and one of his brothers were part of a debate club, and they held their meetings in the local courthouse. During one of these meetings, Ambrose's brother found that his wallet was gone. Ambrose took the initiative and closed the door and locked it, saying there was a thief amongst them, and they must be found out. A young local lawyer became the suspect, and when he refused to let anyone search his person, Ambrose grabbed him by the collar and found the wallet. After the altercation, the lawyer left town, never to be seen again. Ambrose's mother passed away in 1841, and his father began to have trouble paying for the children's education, so he got Ambrose an apprenticeship with a tailor in Centerville. He was skillful at his work, and his good manners and courteous behavior made him welcome at all parties, where he became fond of female companionship. However, his heart wasn't in being a tailor. He began to read any book he could get his hands on, particularly military history. He actively sought out veterans of the War of 1812 and other wars, and would listen intently to their stories. Once his apprenticeship was complete, Ambrose moved back to Liberty, where he opened up a shop with another gentleman, calling it Myers and Burnside Merchant Tailors. Ambrose was a jovial and courteous man, but was never afraid to stand up for himself or others, as exhibited by his handling of the thief. When a man came into his shop and berated him, Ambrose tolerated it for as long as possible before standing up from his shopboard, grabbing the man by the shoulders, and shoving him out into the street. He regularly attended church and became the Sunday school secretary. He and his partner in the tailor shop would talk military tactics and strategy regularly, and use buttons on the tailor board to simulate battles. During one such occasion, Ambrose moved 500 buttons to illustrate soldiers going from columns into line of battle. Ambrose's father decided to gratify his son's ambition, and since Edgehill was in the state legislature, he was able to get the governor and other officials to appoint Ambrose to the United States Military Academy. His classmates when he entered the academy in 1843 were John Gibbon, Charles Griffin, and Orlando B. Wilcox, to name a few. Ambrose Powell Hill would end up graduating with Burnside's class because he took a year off for medical reasons related to contracting gonorrhea. Burnside's roommate was Henry Heath, a Virginian. He grew close and became dear friends with him. They were always getting into trouble and playing practical jokes. At one point in their cadet career, they began to haze newcomers. One cadet from what was called the Far West came to the academy. He possessed long hair and a scruffy beard, which got him the nickname the Bison in the story. Heath told the new cadet that if he went to inspection looking like that, he'd be in prison for 20 days and only be given bread and water to eat and drink. The scared cadet asked what could be done, and Heath said he would take him to the cadet barber. The cadet barber shop was indeed Burnside and Heath's room, with Burnside playing the barber. The Bison asked if Burnside could finish the job before the evening drum beat. Burnside assured him that he could, but as Burnside cut his hair, he timed it so that he only cut one side of his head and shaved only one half of his face by the time the drum beat for evening parade. Burnside and Heath shoved the poor lad out the door. Upon seeing the superintendent of the academy, the Bison saluted, and when he saw the other cadets remove their hats, he did as well, revealing the half-cut head and half-shaven face. The superintendent asked where he received such a cut, and the Bison revealed that the cadet barber had cut it. The superintendent had the Bison show him where the cadet barber was, and took him right to Burnside and Heath's room. Upon entering the room, the superintendent found Burnside and Heath uncontrollably laughing in their beds. Burnside revealed that he was the barber, and the superintendent made Burnside finish the job. For a little time, Burnside's nickname was Cadet Barber. Burnside and Heath jeopardized their schooling by sneaking away to Benny Haven's Tavern, a notorious location where cadets would sneak away to drink against West Point's rules. Because of his rambunctiousness, Burnside accrued a nearly fatal amount of demerits, earning 198 demerits in his first year, 2 away from dismissal. Most of his demerits were small, like absent for breakfast, visiting other cadets outside of designated hours, and other small infractions that added up because of Burnside's unwillingness to wrangle his own self in. Despite his restlessness and his accruing of demerits, Burnside at one point held the rank of cadet lieutenant and cadet captain before returning to the ranks when found absent without leave. In his final year, he took examinations that all cadets were tested on. One of Burnside's biographers explained the severity of the exams. The examinations continued for a fortnight, every forenoon being given to literary work in the library hall, and every afternoon to military drill and evolutions on the parade ground. In the library hall, the members of the examining board and the professors sat at a semicircle table, in front of which 3 large blackboards in frames. The cadets marched in to the tap of the drum in squads of 8 or 10, one being sent to each board to solve a question proposed and one standing with arms folded to answer oral questions. These were put at him with small mercy and with rigid impartiality. Unless promptly answered, he received an unfavorable mark. Whenever a cadet at the blackboard had completed his work, he faced about, folded his arms, and waited till called upon for explanation of his work. The regular business of the other cadets, in study and recitation, continued as though no examination was going on. Cadet Burnside was pronounced by the examiners the finest looking and most soldier-like of the corps, and he was found equally ready when demonstrating mathematical problems on the blackboard or executing maneuvers on the field. One day he was questioned on the preliminary steps and surveys necessary to laying out of a line of railway in any new location, and the requisite calculations in excavating, filling, etc. On another day he was examined on the principle which controlled the relative positions in line of the several companies in a regiment, and upon the evolutions of regiments and brigades. When Burnside finished his exams and graduated in the class of 1847, he stood 18th in his class, representing his middle-of-the-road grades. By the time he graduated, the Mexican-American War was in full swing, and the class of 1847 were called on to join the campaign against Mexico. Burnside and another classmate headed west on rail towards Cincinnati, but the railroad only went so far, and they were obliged to take a stagecoach to the Ohio River. They weren't the only occupants of the coach. They found themselves on board with some nuns and 2 jewelers, making the journey uncomfortable in the small coach. Burnside resolved to ride on top of the coach, under the baggage cover, strapped down, mostly to get a nap. When the coach stopped, a bag of combs and brushes were thrown on top of him, and the new driver thunked his head, allegedly thinking it a watermelon. After that stop, he moved back into the coach, despite the uncomfortableness. In Wheeling, Virginia, they got aboard a steamboat. River pirates, who came aboard ships appearing as regular passengers, plagued many of these boats as they went up and down the river in the United States. The ability to step off at the next port allowed many of their thefts to go unnoticed by their victims until it was too late. Burnside and his friend had become acquainted with the nuns and the jewelers, and they found out they were afraid for their belongings on board. Burnside and his friend took turns guarding the nuns and the jewelers' belongings. Once they got to Cincinnati, Burnside met 2 gentlemen who enticed him to play a game of cards, although it didn't take much to entice Burnside to gamble. He had gotten a taste for it already and loved to play cards. In their first few games, Burnside got the upper hand, but slowly he lost everything. The 2 men had played him. Now Burnside and his friend were destitute, because the other soldier had paid for all the expenses so far, and now was out of money. Worried about how they were to make it to Mexico with no money, they met a gentleman destined for Louisville, who offered to help them. When the ship docked at the city, the 2 soldiers went to the gentleman's house and met his wife and son. The man calculated out how much it would take to travel the rest of the way and gave them the money. Before they left, they sat down for tea with the family, the man and his wife sitting at the table as the little boy stood and gazed at the 2 soldiers. They steamed down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and at New Orleans, the Army recouped the soldiers' travel expenses, which Burnside immediately sent to Louisville to the man who had helped them. Burnside next boarded a ship for the Mexican city of Veracruz, along with a host of other young soldiers eager to win glory in the war. The young men were highly disappointed when they found that the war was virtually over. Burnside was assigned to the 3rd Artillery under the command of Braxton Bragg, and accompanied its supplies and new troops to Mexico City, an already conquered place. Burnside was in an army of occupation. Aside from his official duties, he flirted with Mexican girls who came to parties and took part in Mexican society, but his favorite thing to do while in Mexico was to gamble. As they said, he liked to fight the tiger, or go up against professional gamblers. He soon lost 6 months' worth of his pay and contemplated resigning from the Army, and would have if a senior officer hadn't agreed to give him a loan. It wouldn't be long before Burnside and the 3rd Artillery were headed back to Veracruz and destined for the United States. His first assignment outside of the Mexican-American War was Fort Adams in Rhode Island. During his initial brief stay in Rhode Island, he became a big hit with the towns of Newport and Providence. His regular visits after his official duties were done were welcomed by those towns because of his cordialness and his good humor. Everyone seemed to enjoy his company. In December 1849, he was sent to the New Mexico Territory, but did not act as artillery. He and his unit were equipped and mounted as cavalry. They were to escort people, and particularly the mail, through the territory, defending them against Native American attack and attacks by bandits. When a group of Americans were killed in transit across the landscape, Burnside and a detachment of soldiers went to investigate the scene of the crime, and Burnside acted as a detective. In his report he stated, "From these facts I am led to the following conclusion, that the mail party with 5 or 6 other persons who had joined it arrived at the wagon mound either before the snow fell on the 3rd of this month or whilst the snow was still on the ground, for no tracks of any description could be seen. That the wagon with 8 of the party started from camp, 2 of the party, not of the mail carriers, mounted on American horses, remained at the fire for a short time, afterwards starting, were charged upon by the Indians, who were laying behind the small mound on the foot of the wagon road, their horses killed and themselves wounded. They ran to the wagon and were assisted in getting in by the main party. While in the act of doing this, the party were charged upon by the Indians, thrown in a state of confusion, and finally all killed within 75 yards of the wagon on either side of the road. This opinion is sustained by the fact of the 2 men who were in the wagon being wounded each in the left thigh, the most common wound a man receives on horseback, and one that could not have been inflicted whilst they were in a wagon. No signs were discovered of any Indian being killed. The attacking party were evidently in great numbers, from the large number of arrows found on the ground, but the best evidence of it is the small space within which the whole party were killed." Another incident occurred when a group of Apaches came to the military installation looking for ammunition and other supplies in exchange for furs. The commander wouldn't trade with them because some of their party were identified as having committed crimes against travelers and others had falsely sought peace in the past. The commander ordered Burnside to take 29 other men and follow the Apache back to their camp and arrest the chiefs. When the soldiers caught up to the Apaches, a small skirmish erupted, and Burnside ordered a charge, which drove the enemy about 9 miles and resulted in many Native Americans being killed and Burnside being wounded in the head by an arrow just below the ear. It was during Burnside's time in the territory that he met and hired a free black man from Virginia named Robert Holloway as his personal servant. They would stick together wherever Burnside went. After that, the War Department decided to send cavalry units to the territory, so Burnside and his detachment were sent to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, just outside of St. Louis. Burnside loved the St. Louis Society, and he attended a great many of the balls. On one occasion, Burnside, accompanied by a host of ladies, came to the hotel where the dance was to be held. When the ladies got there, what was described as a disreputable person addressed the ladies and told them to view the dance from the balcony and not come down to the dance floor. Rumor swirled, and even a newspaper ran an article stating that Burnside kept the ladies from dancing because he didn't believe they should interact with St. Louis society. He was so irate that he would be lied about in the paper that he got a leave of absence for a fortnight and went to the newspaper office and, as they said, cowhided a man. Constables came to the barracks to arrest Burnside for assault and battery, but some St. Louis citizens interfered and Burnside was able to return to duty. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War and provided the United States with half of Mexico's territory. The boundary needed to be surveyed, and when the Survey Commission, made up of military and civilian commissioners, both U.S. and Mexican, got into a heated debate about commissary stores, it was decided to send an able officer to join the surveyors as the quartermaster. Burnside was chosen as the new commissary and quartermaster. He traveled through San Antonio, then through the Guadalupe Mountains to the surveyors, but the American surveyors were in a heated argument. The civilian and military commissioners both wanted to air their grievances and get instructions on how to proceed, so they each sent their own representatives with a letter describing the situation to the Washington office. Burnside was chosen by the military commissioner to deliver his letter. It became a race to Washington, with the civilian going through San Antonio and the southern states, and Burnside, accompanied by Robert Holloway and 2 others, taking the old Santa Fe Trail to the Missouri River. The dry desert landscape plagued the group of men as they traveled toward Fort Leavenworth. One of Burnside's biographers described the scene. Lieutenant Burnside had also to contend with the Indians, who were well mounted and armed with lances and bows and arrows. One party followed his trail for more than 24 hours, and he only escaped through the darkness of night, which enabled him to elude his pursuers. His guide, a veteran frontier mail rider, twice lost his way, and on one occasion they were 11 hours without water. They saw several immense herds of buffalo, which would sometimes cross their road a few hundred yards in front of them, and kneeling down, toss the dust into the air with their horns, and then dash off again, with their long beards and manes waving in the wind. They ate some of the choice parts of all of which they killed, and carried a few pieces along with them, leaving the remainder for the attendant pack of wolves. When they arrived at Fort Leavenworth, they were so worn out with fatigue and want of sleep that the surgeon ordered them to be waked every half hour, walked about for 5 minutes, and then fed with beef tea. Burnside then traveled to St. Louis, where he got on a steamboat headed east. He made it to Washington in 31 days, a full month ahead of the civilian. After both letters were read by the Secretary of the Interior, it was decided to move Colonel Graham of the Corps of Engineers from the assignment and replace him with Major W. H. Emory to hopefully bring tranquility between the surveyors and the commissioners. Burnside didn't go back to the Southwest. After a discussion with the Secretary of War, he was ordered to stay in Washington at the Arsenal to develop a breech-loading carbine that Burnside had come up with on his journey to Washington. One of his men on the journey dropped his carbine into a stream. The next day the lock rusted so much that it became unserviceable, so Burnside's mind began to turn to find a way to improve on weaponry and make it less susceptible to water fouling the piece. While in Washington, he developed patterns for the weapon, but on December 16, 1851, he was promoted to first lieutenant and given a furlough to visit his family in Indiana. His family was happy to see him, but Burnside had other plans on his mind than just visiting family. In Hamilton, Ohio, not far away, he had begun a long-distance courtship with a young Kentucky girl, and on this trip he was determined to marry her. He asked, and she accepted. They quickly chose a date, and during the ceremony the preacher asked if Burnside took her to be his bride. He said yes, and when she was asked if she would take Burnside, she said no. The wedding ended without the two being married, and Burnside became distraught over his lost love. Legend goes that the next man she agreed to marry was so scared from Burnside's story that during the ceremony he carried a pistol and told her that she would either be his wife or a corpse. The two were married, and she was apparently a devoted wife. Burnside was still assigned to duty on the Boundary Commission, but in March 1852 he was reassigned to Fort Adams in Rhode Island. Again, Burnside fell into the Newport and Providence societies with great ease because of his likability. People from all over the United States spent their summers in Rhode Island, and Burnside became acquainted with many of the young ladies who came with their families to New England on vacation. The troops in the fort also loved Burnside. His mild manner but firm-loving character made him an instant hit with the troops. Lieutenant Burnside was not only popular with the officers and men of his command, but with the members of the volunteer militia associations of Rhode Island, who sought the acquaintance and the advice of those who had received military educations. His courteous and considerate manner, which was no outward form, but the natural result and the true reflex of his kindly disposition, made him a general favorite in the militia armories. Among the organizations with the members of which he became acquainted was the Marine Artillery Corps of Providence, which Mr. William Sprague, afterwards the governor of Rhode Island, had made so efficient in drill that it compared favorably with the light batteries of the regular army. It was at a ball put on by Sprague that Burnside met Mary Richmond Bishop, a Rhode Islander. After a quick courtship, they were married on April 27, 1852. Mrs. Burnside turned the casemate into a home for the couple, and she began to refine his rough ways. For example, when a man delivered Burnside a bottle of wine purchased by Burnside in the city and sat it down so hard that it broke, Burnside broke out in a stream of obscene language at the man. When the man had left, Mrs. Burnside rose up from her seat, went to her husband, and placing her hand on his shoulder, as she looked him calmly in the face, said, "My dear, you have shocked me by swearing so. Don't, I beg you, ever let me hear you use profane language again." From that day, an oath rarely escaped General Burnside's lips, although he was often sorely tempted to relieve his feelings by an energetic use of the King's English. The couple didn't stay in Fort Adams long. Burnside resigned from the army on November 1st, 1852. He set out to start his new civilian life with his wife, and along with the capital from some of his friends, began to establish a factory to manufacture his breech-loading weapon.